Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the properties of subconscious paths. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in this video, I wouldn't consider it super important to understanding subconscious paths. We really talked about most of the important stuff last video, and then in the next video we're going to talk about how to charge subconscious paths. But I thought there was some stuff that were interesting enough, right, to be worth making a video for. So we're just going to talk about some interesting properties or consequences of what subconscious paths are. So the first thing I want to mention is that last video I actually think I mentioned that subconscious paths were an ordered set of subjects or categories. I actually meant to say they're an ordered set of subconscious memories, right? They could be associated, they're also associated with the ordered set of subjects or categories. So it's not a super big difference, but I just want to be clear that more specifically, like I said, I like to make definitions very precise, right? So the more precise definition of the subconscious past is that there are ordered set of subconscious memories, right? So, but it's probably not that, doesn't make a big difference if you use the definition. If you call them an ordered set of subjects or ordered set of subconscious memories, there's probably not a huge difference between the two in most contexts. But because a subconscious path is an ordered set of subconscious memories, which corresponds to an ordered set of subjects or categories, the properties that they have are going to be very similar to the same properties associated with subconscious memory associated with a subject or category. However, there are some properties that are a little bit different that you kind of only get when looking at a subconscious path. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the property of length, right? So subconscious paths have a characteristic of length. And all that means is that a path can be shorter or longer, right? So if you can just imagine a path like a road or not exactly a road, probably not the best example since they keep going, but you can imagine a path or a walkway could be very short or very long, right? So the same thing's true in subconscious memory. And just as an example, we talked about how to form a subconscious path, right, you would have to keep repeating a set of behaviors over and over and over again, right? We'll talk more specifically about how they charge in the next video, but for the moment, if you repeat a sequence of behaviors or a set of behaviors over and over, then a subconscious path will charge or will form and charge in subconscious memory, right? So, and we talked about it last video with the dance routine. So if you keep, if you're rehearsing, if you have to perform a dance routine for some performance, right, on stage, then you would go to rehearsal. And you rehearse by just repeating the same behaviors over and over and over again, performing those same dance routines. And as you keep practicing and keep rehearsing it, eventually, at the beginning it's hard to kind of remember. You have to keep stopping and remembering what you're supposed to do next. But eventually you'll reach a point where you could just seamlessly perform all these steps very easily without really even thinking much about it on the conscious level. And that's because the subconscious path has charged, right, from all of your rehearsing. And when it's charged, if you focus on the first dance pose in the dance routine, which is the first subject within the subject path, when you focus on that first subject and you access the subconscious memory associated with it, you feel a compulsion to move into a dance pose and then focus on the next dance pose focus on the next subject in the path. And when you do that, you feel an urge to move into another dance pose, then direct your attention to the next subject in the path, which is the third dance pose, and then so on and so forth. So when you access that first dance pose, you'll feel a natural compulsion to just do the rest, right? Until your subconscious or your positive mind is actually directing you to perform the series of steps in the dance routine. So in other words, it's in a certain sense your mind or your attention is traveling the subconscious path, right? Now we can imagine that a dance routine that has 1,000 steps, right, would be a lot easier to charge, or actually, let me actually read this first because I wanted to talk about that length first. So a 1,000 step dance routine has greater length than a 5-step dance routine. And paths with greater lengths take a longer time to charge, right? So basically, like I said, in order to charge a subconscious path, you would repeat a series of steps or a sequence of behaviors. So clearly, it would take a lot longer to repeat a sequence of behaviors if it has 1,000 steps to it than a routine, or it take a lot longer to charge a subconscious path that consists of a dance routine with 1,000 steps than a dance routine that only has 5 steps, right? Because it would take a lot longer for me to constantly repeat those 1,000 steps than the amount of time it takes for me to repeat those 5 steps, right? So the subconscious path, that's a longer subconscious path, right, or a long subconscious path, takes much more time to charge than a short subconscious path, right? The longer the path, the more time it takes to charge it, in other words. Right, so that's one property I just thought was useful to talk about. So another property of subconscious paths is that they can actually have a kind of circular shape to them, right? And that corresponds to kind of looping behavior or repeating behaviors. So and I'll explain it, but just to go over this, paths can also form a circular shape that allows them to cause looping or repeating behavior, and this occurs when a song is stuck in your head, right? So you've probably experienced that many times, right, where a song is just stuck in your head and keeps playing over and over and over again, or you feel a compulsion to keep playing it in your mind. You can resist it, but it's kind of hard to, right? And so why does that occur? What's actually happening on a subconscious level? Well, so like we said before, a song into your subconscious memory actually represents a subconscious path, right? And that path consists of implicit subject forms or implicit category forms, right? But it still would represent a series of subjects or categories. And when I focus on one part of the song, we'll just say some random part, I will feel compulsion to say, not only to sing that part, but to say the next part of the song immediately after it. And then if I keep following those compulsions, I'll just feel a compulsion to sing along with the song. So that's how it would look in reality, or to a person observing someone else consciously. They would feel an urge to just sing along with the song, and then do the reflection principle, also playing the song in their mind and just playing it in their mind. They're hearing the sound in their mind, or imagining the sound in their mind, right? Now, what's interesting is that in this process, right? So the songs have a particular structure. So we talked about a little bit about in chapter 7 how certain things you observe can have certain arrangement patterns, right? And those arrangement patterns can approximate subconscious forms. We'll talk a little more about this concept later, because we're going to talk about organizational patterns. We're going to talk about transcendental creativity, where we kind of talk much more about some of these ideas, and we talk about them in a much more complete way. But for now, I had mentioned that there's certain arrangement patterns in nature that approximate subconscious forms, right? And your subconscious is a very easy time kind of focusing on those arrangement patterns or organizational patterns. I also refer to them as, right? And so, for example, a joke represents a certain arrangement pattern that's associated with the laughter or humor frequency, right? Now, to the conscious mind, it's kind of very difficult to observe or work with arrangement patterns in that way, but the subconscious is very easy. So from subconscious perspective, it's very easy and very natural to deal with arrangement patterns. That's basically its language, right? So songs also have an arrangement pattern. And I mentioned this before, actually. I kind of forgot. But I mentioned this before, too, in Chapter 7, when I talked about the theory of entertainment. So, like I said before, songs have a specific arrangement pattern that, from subconscious perspective, has a very specific look to it, and the subconscious can work with them very easily. So songs have an arrangement pattern where they have a chorus, and they have a verse and chorus, and intro and outro, things like that. But the chorus part repeats, and it repeats over and over, more so than the other parts of the song. And because of that, your subconscious charges much more around the chorus part because it's constantly repeating. So the subconscious is very volatile around the chorus. And what can end up happening, and it's also true that when you're making music and making beats, you want to try to make them in a way that just sounds like they're looping. So I do the same thing when I'm making beats. That's just a part of music theory in general. But because of all of that, what can end up happening is that when you hear a certain part of the song, excuse me, when you hear a certain part of the song or you actually get to the end of a song, it's actually possible for that subject to kind of cause your mind to draw its attention back to an earlier subject within the loop. Within the subject subconscious path. And when your attention gets drawn to that subject in the subconscious path, what will actually happen is you'll feel a compulsion to think or do something that's associated with that subject, but then you'll draw your attention to the next subject, and the next subject, and that keeps happening until you get to the end of the subconscious path, and then that draws you back. That'll cause you to draw your attention back to the earlier part in the subconscious path. It doesn't have to be the beginning, but it could be an earlier part. And then the process just keeps repeating itself, so you actually can get stuck in the loop. And in that sense, a subconscious path actually can kind of have almost like a circular kind of shape to it. So I know it's kind of weird to apply geometric principles to something so abstract, but that's kind of how I started thinking about it. So as an example, let's say you're listening to a song and you hear the chorus, right? And then the chorus, you hear the chorus, let's say the last subject that represents the subconscious path of the chorus, because you're so used to hearing the song, the chorus over and over, that part of the chorus might actually loop to the earlier part of the chorus, or that subject will cause your mind to draw its attention back to the earlier part of the chorus, right, rather than to the next part or the next verse. And it may not even be that there's a next verse, right? So, but when you hear it at the, when you draw your attention to let's just say the last subject within that subject series, that subject, the subconscious memory associated with that subject will redirect your attention back to the first subject in the subject series representing the chorus. And if that keeps happening, or when that happens, you'll just follow a loop over and over and over again. And that's actually why songs get stuck in your head. So some version or variation of that is why a song gets stuck in your head, right? And that can actually happen with other things too. But the one I'm aware of mostly is with a song. So that's just wanted to talk about that phenomenon. So that's what's happening there. It may be possible that there are other shapes that form in subconscious memory, but the main one that I became aware of is a more circular shape or just a more linear shape, right? I drew these things here. They're not too important, but I just drew them here as an example to say that in the subconscious path, let's say you get to the end of a subconscious path or the last subject or category, your attention could be drawn to an earlier part in the subconscious path, or not necessarily beginning where you started, or it could just go back to the beginning. So it just depends on how you look at it. So this next point I wanted to talk about, again, it's not super important, but I thought it was worth discussing. So subconscious paths can actually allow you to experience different emotions or frequencies very intensely or very purely, because we actually made that distinction last chapter. But they allow you to experience emotions very intensely or purely at different times. So the reason I want to talk about that is because the way we talked about charging in chapter 11 and chapter 12, we basically just talked about focusing on a single subject or category, right, and telling some story that revolves around it. So that subject carries the charge, or it's the main memory which carries the charge and is becoming more and more positive. Now, the way we spoke about it made more sense mostly just to focus on one frequency when you focus on that subject. Now, in theory, you can focus on multiple frequencies. So I can focus on a subject and tell one story that favors one frequency, then later I could tell another story that favors a different frequency and keep switching back and forth so I feel both frequencies when focused on that subject. Or I could just tell some story that mixes the frequencies and charge both while focused on that subject too. The problem with doing that, though, is that I'm not going to be able to feel any one frequency more and more and more intensely, right? Because I'm spending time charging both. In a certain sense, you might say I'm wasting time charging both frequencies. And that's going to make it harder to feel both frequencies at a higher level of intensity, right? So the more frequencies I try to charge at once, or the more single subject or subconscious memory, the more frequencies stored in that memory, the less I'm going to feel any one very intensely. So it doesn't always make sense. That's why we didn't really talk about that scenario, because it doesn't make that much sense to try to charge multiple frequencies when you're just trying to feel charged for the purpose of emotion. But for subconscious paths, it's a little different, right? Because now you're trying to charge for the purpose of performance or charge as it relates to some activity. Now, a path itself can be charged in such a way where, as you're traveling the path, you can feel an intense amount of motion here, and you travel the path and you feel an intense amount of motion at a different frequency here, right? So that's possible. I think you see a version of that with movies. Now, movies are a tiny bit different because you don't necessarily have to watch a movie over and over and over again to charge a subconscious path. There is some version of that still happening even while you're watching the movie. And that has to do with something called, well, we talked about subject closeness in the case of single subjects and categories. There's also a version of subject closeness that occurs with subconscious paths. Or if we're going to talk about, I think we talk about that after subconscious charging. I forget exactly where in the book, but we talk about this a little later in the chapter. So movies allow you to basically charge, they allow you to have a emotional response to them by a variation of subject closeness. So you are technically still repeating some activity when you're watching a movie. We'll talk about that a little later, but they also rely on the fact that the movie's new, and they rely on the danger frequency, and there's different things they kind of do to get you to still feel emotion. But that's really like an exception, not the rule. But still, when you watch a movie over and over again, a subconscious path will charge and it will form, and it'll allow you to feel different emotions at different points. And the same thing's true, let's say, for category charge. So if I want to charge my subconscious to be good at conversation, which, like I said, I used to do a lot, I could charge my subconscious in a way where I'm able to be very creative at this frequency. Let's say it's the humor or laughter frequency. So I'm really good at telling jokes, but I can also charge it to be very creative at saying like smooth lines. So that would be closer to like the love frequency or some version of the romance frequency or whatever. I could charge it to be very confident in this particular area. So I can charge multiple, well, we haven't talked too much about multiple subconscious paths, but I could charge multiple subconscious paths, right? So that I can perform at different frequencies for relatively the same activity. So I just thought that was useful to mention. And then the last thing I want to talk about is basically everything we've been talking about now, we're using what I call path formalism, right? So we're using the concept of subconscious paths in terms of subconscious memory, right? To talk about how the positive mind or the subconscious mind is involved in an activity or compels you during an activity. But I want to use path formalism to talk about charging in a way we used to when we weren't using path formalism at all. I basically want to show that path formalism just reduces to whatever we talked about before in those cases. So let's say I want to use path formalism to talk about charging emotion, right? Well, we said earlier that a subconscious path charges as you keep repeating a series of behaviors, right? So now when I'm charging for emotion, I just want to make some emotion, preferably a single frequency, as intense as possible, or charge around a single frequency, right? So if I want to make it as intense as possible, as quickly as possible, I would want the subconscious path to be very, 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 very short, right? So I don't want it to be very long. Now, I also want my subconscious to stick around the same frequency because I want to charge up at that frequency. And I have to keep repeating some sequence of behaviors that keeps my subconscious around the same frequency. So naturally, I would keep producing some intention that keeps my subconscious around the same frequency. And so I would generally tell some story, right? Remember what we said, the subconscious likes its commands in the form of a story. So I'd tell some story in my mind, and I would make the path very short and keep repeating it over and over again. And as I keep looping around that path or keep repeating that path and keep my subconscious at that frequency, that path should charge very quickly. And so as you can see, now we talked about in chapter 11 about how you would tell a story in a way that kind of just keeps looping around over and over, so you just keep your subconscious around that same frequency. That story would be very short, right? I don't know that we exactly mentioned that, but generally, yeah, the story, if you've done it, you should know, or you should have seen it. But the story would be very, very short. In other words, that corresponds to a short subconscious path. So in other words, if we use path formalism to talk about charging an emotion, as you can see, it just literally reduces to what we already spoke about, which is why we didn't use path formalism at that time. There's no need to. right? However, if you're talking about charging the subconscious for some kind of performance, so if we're talking about charging it for a dance routine, or charging it to compel you through a song, right? Or to even feel different emotions at different parts of the song. What we talked about before isn't going to cut it, right? It's just not, there's not enough, the theoretical framework isn't developed enough to handle those types of circumstances, right? So that's why we needed path formalism, right? So yeah, just wanted to basically establish that the bigger picture has always been path formalism. And we did actually refer to a little bit when we talked about not statements and subconscious dissonance, right? So I think I mentioned when you produce the intention of not wanting something, a subconscious path will actually form where in that subconscious path where you feel like you're getting closer to something, you feel a little bit better. No, excuse me. When you feel like you're getting closer to something, you feel worse. And when you feel like you're getting further away from something, you feel better, right? So that's generally the behavior, the subconscious path that develops as it relates to that particular frequency, right? Or a frequency associated with not wanting something. Or feeling like something's bad, right? If it happens, I should say. So we talked a tiny bit, we appealed to path formalism a little bit for that, but for the most part we didn't really need to. But you definitely need to when talking about some performance, right? And that example also relates to a degree to performance. So yeah, like I said, these properties aren't super important, but I thought they were useful enough or interesting enough to talk about here. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how to actually charge a subconscious path, right? We're going to talk more directly about how to charge it. I forget what comes after that in the book. I think we're going to talk about the process of subject closeness as it relates to different subconscious paths, things like that. But I'll look at it. But for the next video, we're going to talk about how to charge them, right? So, but that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.